We're at the Friar's Bush Graveyard in Belfast. We're going to meet a local historian who's going to tell us all about it. Let's go.
This place, Friar's Bush, is a haunt of ancient peace, surrounded by the busy modern city of Belfast. And it is an ancient burying ground which has been preserved intact in the modern city. The first reference we have to here dates from an old map of 1567, where it's referred to as Friar's Town. And many old maps of that era include Friar's Town. So there was a community of holy men who lived here. And we can imagine what sort of life they would have had. They would have been some sort of mendicant friars, maybe Franciscans, with a vow of poverty and charity. And here would have been important in maps from those times because they would have had some sort of house of welcome here, like a tavern. Here's fertile land. They would have grown their own crops. They would have distilled their own whiskey, baked their own bread, distilled their own beer. So this would have been a little waypoint, somewhere to stay. Very small population back then. The ancient highway out of Belfast, the Malone Road, goes past here. So those coming up from the valley or going down to the valley would have passed Friar's Town. And there would have been some form of accommodation here. And as part of their charitable function, think back to the 1500s, this horror that happened more times than you could imagine. It was extended families living in little clusters around the valley. And you come down with a disease. You start coughing, a few days later you're coughing up blood, you get blotches in your skin, and all of your family and friends will love you, but we don't want to have whatever you have. You end up an outcast. Bell round your neck, unclean. These friars, they would have taken in people like that. They would have had a couple of huts out the back. They would feed you, they would care for you, comfort you, they would pray for you. And inevitably, most often, you would have died. And hence, there's a burying ground to the east of this, where this little settlement stood. Just the right place for it to be as well, because you would always have your burying ground to the east of your church. And there was once a little church here as well. Okay, I'd like to tell you a story of a refusal of burial in Friar's Bush. A very tragic story, and this is a story of Mary Hughes. Her mother lived in Ballinafie Cottages. I think the little row of cottages, it still stands at the very top of the Ormo Road. And Mary had been in service in Liverpool. She came home and she announced to her mother that she was pregnant. There was some family disagreement, and shortly afterwards she was found hanged in her mother's cottage. And this tragic incident was followed by family, friends and neighbours then leading a procession down the Ormo Road, over the Ormo Bridge and up to the gates of Friar's Bush. And those gates were locked. The sexton informed the large crowd that the clergy were refusing admission because she was a suicide and could not be buried on consecrated ground. A near riot ensued and the police were called. The matter was resolved whenever they contacted the Belfast Charitable Society, who agreed that she could be buried in what is now Clifton Street Cemetery. So Mary Hughes is buried in an unmarked grave in the Strangers' Ground there. And that is the tragic story of Mary Hughes. Another story involving the gates being locked at Friar's Bush is a very dramatic one, and it was in one of the earlier phases of the sectarian division of Belfast in 1864. And this started in Dublin on what is now known as O'Connell Street. Then it was known as Sackville Street. And this was an grand occasion on the 8th of August, and the nationalists of Ireland had flooded by train to Dublin, including many from Belfast, for the laying of the foundation stone of the memorial to Daniel O'Connell. The Belfast contingent on their special trains came back to Belfast and were greeted by a burning effigy of Daniel O'Connell on the Boyne Bridge on Sandy Road. And the next day, the Loyalists of Sandy Road took this further. They took the ashes of the effigy of Daniel O'Connell and put them in a coffin. And they got a mock priest and they had a mock funeral. And they marched from Sandy Row, followed by thousands of Loyalists to the gates of Friars Bush. Again, as in the previous story, the gates were locked. And the sexton, a man called Patrick McCabe, and his son were standing here with legally held firearms, and they managed to keep this large and angry crowd at bay. The crowd then retreated to Sandy Row again, and the Blackstaff River was still uncovered at that time. They threw the coffin into the waters of the Blackstaff, and from there floated downstream towards the River Lagan. And that is the story of the mock burial of Daniel O'Connell in Friars Bush. When we look at this cobbled carriageway, I'd really think of it as being a Gothic portal to another world. And a late great local historian, Dr. Eamon Phoenix, referred to this as a place of ancient mystery. And in the 1890s, one of the most successful Irish artists ever, Paul Henry, he lived here and he wrote of his thoughts about this place when he was young, growing up in the 1880s, really, in Belfast. And he said about it, "Nothing on earth would have persuaded me to enter the place. I passed that way many times as child and later as a boy, but I've never been inside. Sometimes on a dark night, I would hear the rusty old gate clanging in the wind, but would see not one going in or out. And after nightfall, when no light shone from the tiny window, it was the house of the dead." Where we are now is in front of the ancient burying ground. So this was a country graveyard, sitting in fields about an Irish mile south of Belfast, such as Belfast was back then. And something very dramatic happened here in 1690, a very resonant year in our history, because King William of Orange, after spending a few days in the very small settlement of Belfast, he marched with his enormous army to the River Boyne. He battled with King James II, his father-in-law, and he won and culturally changed Ireland. And one of the first and most marked changes was the oppression of the native Irish people, particularly with regards to their Roman Catholicism. And he then introduced the Popery Acts, commonly known as the penal laws. And they did many things to socially disadvantage the Roman Catholics of Ireland to try and discourage their religion. And one of the things that they did to increasing severity was to outlaw priests. There's a bounty, £10 for a priest, £100 for a bishop, priest hunters. And it was illegal to say a Catholic Mass. And the penalty for that at one point was death. And it is said that a secret mass was held just here, sometime before the year 1717, because that was the first reference to the name Friar's Bush, and that a friar was caught celebrating this mass, that he was shot on this spot and buried under what is now known as the Friar's Bush. So this Friar's Bush, it's a scrappy looking tree. It's a hawthorn or blackthorn tree. And this has a certain place in Irish culture. It's a fairy thorn, a fairy tree. So it's quite common in these ancient places to have a little tree like this. And because of that event, then this place became popularly known as the Friar's Bush. And there's a little poem that was written about here called The Friar's Bush in 1905 by a local man called Joseph Campbell. And the first verse of it goes, "In penal times, as peasants tell, a friar came with book and bell to chant his mass each Sabbath morn beneath Stranmillis trysting thorn." Where we are now on the old burying ground, this was a traditional place of burial between fields in the countryside, about an Irish mile south of the small settlement of Belfast. And it was particularly apparent in newspaper reports into the early 1800s that body snatching was a regular occurrence here. And that's only from the cases that they found out. Now, why here? Well, I suspect that this was one of the richest hunting grounds for body snatchers in all of Ireland for particular reasons. Firstly, here wasn't monitored in any way. It was out in the countryside. There was nobody guarding it. Secondly, the location. It was beside a large population, regular burials here, plenty of fresh cadavers. There was a regular service from the harbour of Belfast across to Greenock to bring bodies to Glasgow and even Edinburgh. So other ones would have been guarded, such as Shankill and Clifton Street. There was none of that here. And it was talked about that here, people were buried, covered in a mere stratum of earth. Very easy for the body snatchers to do their dastardly work. And why did they do this? Well, there were very strong economic forces at play. A modest working man could get between 2 and 3 years' wages for supplying a fresh sample to the medical rooms of Glasgow. So it was commonplace here because of course, you only hear of the stories that make the news. And they tended to be bodies found in hedges nearby or in boxes. There's a surprisingly large number of those stories from the 1820s in particular. One of them from 1823 involves 2 body snatchers who were caught in the act, as it were. They were called Stewart and Feeney. And Feeney had brought a barrel down to the docks late in the evening, and people were a bit suspicious about it. So they opened the barrel. It was packed with sawdust, and in it were the naked bodies of an elderly woman and a child. Now, they were not related. Word was put out, they were allowed out to be claimed, and they were each claimed by their families. In the report, it did mention that the lady was Mrs. Bell, the late wife of Mr. William Bell, who was a shoemaker in Forest Lane. So in that case, they were reinterred and I assume guarded to keep the body snatchers away. So this became a big issue in 1828, 1829, whenever the Botanic Gardens were being established. Because this burying ground was sitting right in the middle, inconveniently in the middle of the land that the Botanic Gardens were going to be on. It's closed in a lot more now, but then it would have been completely surrounded by the gardens. So the Marquis of Donegal, the aristocratic landowner, he came up with a solution that he would rent an acre of land connecting this burying ground to the road on the condition that a wall 9 feet tall is built around the whole site. So that served two purposes. It blocked the view of the unsightly and insanitary burying ground. Why unsightly and insanitary? Well, I don't know if you'd have bones sticking out of the ground, but it wouldn't surprise me. Certainly you would get corners of coffins sticking out of the ground, and they talked about the miasma in the air. I won't elaborate any more on that. And the wall then hid all of this from sight, and of course it also, with the benefit of the gate lodge as well, kept the Bodysnatchers out. So that resolved the problem here. And actually only a few years later, the Anatomy Act was passed in 1832, which changed that. It really it removed the black market, as it were, for fresh corpses for medical research. And that's just a little flavour of the story of body snatching in this place, this particularly rich hunting ground for the resurrectionists of Belfast. I'm now standing on the top of the ancient country burying ground of Friar's Bush, and it's quite elevated from the land around, and really over the centuries, with every interment in here, the ground has been raised a little, and there was no control back then. Everybody just dug around, rooted around, pushed bones aside, threw in the remains of their own loved ones, and covered it over again. So I'm literally standing on a hill of bones. And there are old headstones here. There's a broken off one there, and time, nature, weathering and vandalism has taken its toll, but the oldest ones here are from the early 1700s. And many of them are broken and are loose, and they're lying around the place. So we've been gathering some of those up. So let's have a little look at some of those now. So these are some of the fragments of headstones that we have found. At an earlier stage, we tidied up a bit and cleared around here and there, and you find bits of stone sticking out or lying in the grass, and I'll just explain a few of them. This is the oldest we've found. It's beautifully and quirkily inscribed, and it's partial inscription, and I can infer what the rest was. Here lies ye body of, it's A.N., so maybe Alan Beggs, who departed this life ye 9th day of January in ye year of our Lord 1736, aged, maybe 40 years, something like that, years. So we don't know anything more about him at all. So but it's just in the right lighting as well. It really stands out. It's a beautifully and quirkily inscribed piece from long in the past. So here's a fascinating stone, again beautifully produced, and there's two flowers at the top, which is very appropriate, because if I read this, it says, "Here lieth the body of William Anderson." Bit of a mistake in the spelling of Anderson there. Gardener in Malone, who died the 2nd of September 1754, aged 56 years. And then it's broken off, so it said below it something like, "Also here lieth the body of some, maybe family or wife." Hopefully someday we'll come upon the rest of this stone. It'd be lovely to reunite the pieces. So this man was a gardener at Malone. So that is there's two likely places: Malone House, an earlier version of Malone House, which stands a mile and a half further south of here, or Cranmore House as well, because it was known as also as Malone Cottage. So he worked at one of those two places. But this is the only information we have on this man. And it illustrates how you can get a little story from the past just from a fragment of stone that you come across. So a very good example here with William Anderson Gardner in Malone. So this is another lovely piece. Again, it tells something of the history of Belfast, just in one piece of stone. So I'll read out what it says on it. Here it says, erected by Mary Angelinetta in memory of her husband Peter Angelinetta, slate merchant and native of Italy, who died in Belfast January the 16th, 1835, aged 51 years. So there were many Italian tradesmen who came to Belfast because of their skills in the building trade. Of course, Italy has some of the finest buildings in the world, and some of these men with their many building skills came to Belfast, and that was quite a tradition for a long time. But it's particularly lovely. Peter Angelinetta was a slate merchant, and here is his memorial on a lovely piece of slate. I wonder, did it come from his own stock? What you see now is a wild, unkept, overgrown part of Friar's Bush Cemetery. And this was opened 1829, 1830 as the Paupers Plot, the stranger's ground. For those who died in absolute poverty, for beggars found dead in the streets, and many other sad specimens, this would be somewhere to bury them with dignity. And come 1832, the cholera epidemic hit Belfast. For decades, it went back and forward across the Atlantic, hitting all of the major seaports, and Belfast was no exception. And nobody knew what to do about it. They didn't know how to treat it, how to stop it spreading. And there were reports of the dead carts bringing the bodies up to Friar's Bush. And it's said that at that time they piled the bodies at the back and burned them. They were trying to eradicate the disease. They didn't know what to do. And the remains, then they buried here. But the worst was yet to come, because the potato famine arrived. Late 1845, the blight had started to destroy the potato crops. 1846, the seed crops were eaten. 1847, black. 1847 was a bleak year in Ireland. And there is a misconception that it didn't affect Belfast, the growing industrial centre in the north, which is not true. Of course, in the rocky, boggy west of Ireland, the land was cleared of people. It wasn't so bad in Belfast, but we suffered very badly. This is one of 3 famine graves, 3 mass graves in the Belfast area, where those who died of malnutrition and of disease at that time are buried. So at that time, the workhouse was near here, where the city hospital now stands, and many of these poor people died in the workhouse. There would have been no taking them home for a wake. There would be no respectful laying out of the bodies in the church. They were suffering from famine fever, from typhus. They would have been brought straight here and put into an enormous 12-foot deep pit in the ground. And as much as a funeral as these poor people would have been, they would have been dropped through a trapdoor and a couple of shovels of quicklime put in after them. So this area has an enormous number of people who died horrendously buried here. So I think it is very appropriate and respectful that this place should always, this uneven, broken ground should always grow wild. This is the place of rest of thousands of people who died horribly, horribly. And I think it's an appropriate way to remember them and to respect them for to leave this ground as it is and to tell their story. I was very interested and intrigued today to find below this headstone erected by Anne Ward in memory of her sister Jane Campbell, that below this headstone there is a wasp's nest. So they've burrowed down underneath and they're very busy coming backwards and forwards. And it put me in mind of a rather interesting story about Friar's Bush. It was so interesting that it was actually published in the London papers in 1816. And the story was a simple enough little story. They were digging to bury somebody in the burying ground at Friar's Bush, and they dug a bit deeper than usual. And one of the skulls, I like the casualness of this mention, one of the skulls that they lifted out of the ground, they realised to their amazement that it had a beehive in it. And they noticed that one side of the skull it was full of cells of honey, and the other side of the skull was full of cells of baby bees. So rather an unusual thing. So the bees must have burrowed down as they usually would to make their nest, and they were saved a lot of work because, hey, here was a lovely big cavity that they could fill with cells of honey. So it's interesting to see that today there are still insects burrowing down into the ground below. Okay, this is a story from 1854 where a woman called Jane Smith took some men to court. She was challenging them for burying a child in what she claimed to be her husband's grave. And this one was called Jane Smith, and she was taking a group of men, including John Townley. He was wanting to bury his child in here, and John Donnelly, who was the sexton who lived in the gate lodge. She had heard that it was intended to bury this child in a certain grave, and she came early in that morning and she sat on the grave all day, refusing to let the child be buried there because she claimed that's where her husband was buried. Eventually, later in the day, the sexton and John Townley and others dragged her from the grave and started digging. And they didn't seem to be too respectful about the remains that were in there, because they eventually came to a leg bone and they threw it at Jane Smith and said, "Use that as a walking staff." And then a short while later they came to the skull and they threw that at her and said, "You can use that as a snuff box." And they buried, in this traumatic circumstance, then the child was buried in the grave. And Jane Smith then obviously didn't let the matter rest and took these men to court, and this case was heard in front of the magistrate. So the horrendous story of the poor widow, Jane Smith, and the bones of her husband. Friar's Bush graveyard has thousands, tens of thousands of sad stories in it, and each one's got its own character, and this particularly tragic tale is the story of the 7-hour marriage. On Friday, the 22nd of June, 1849, a young couple got married in Belfast. Neither of them were from Belfast. Patrick Breen, he was a private in the army, based in Victoria Barracks. He was 25 years of age, he was from Dublin, and he married Sarah Smith. She was a maid in a house on what was then Botanic Road, now Botanic Avenue. And they were married at noon on that day. And the next morning, a man called James Carson, a labourer, was digging sand in the sand hole, a big sand quarry, where the Ashby Institute, that big tall white building now stands, where I actually studied when I was at Queen's. Mechanical engineering based in there. This cartman, James Carson, was digging and he came upon a bonnet. He dug further and to his horror he found two bodies, the bodies of Patrick and Sarah. So it was thought afterwards, they were last seen about before 7 on the Friday evening, and they were walking up the Malone Road, just from the bottom of the Malone Road, and it had started to rain. So it was apparent that they went and sat on a plank behind a sheltered area in the sand hole. And Patrick Breen had put his new bride's coat over the two of them. She was sitting on his knee and he had his arm around her wrist. They were sheltering from the rain. And the sandbank behind them, no doubt, the rain had an effect on this, slumped and fell on them. It's thought that as much as 8 tons of sand was deposited on top of the unfortunate couple. So there was great shock and horror naturally at this, and they had a funeral for them on the Sunday. And there were thousands of people of Belfast turned out in sympathy. And Sarah and Patrick, for the second time, were buried in Friar's Bush graveyard. The headstone that you see before you was placed here in 1847 by William Davy Flesher. And unfortunately, he bought this burial lot to inter his wife, Margaret, who had died on the 29th of May. Now, this was Black 47, the worst year of the potato famine. And it is quite likely that she died of typhus, famine fever, which, although they were a prosperous family, rich people contracted the same diseases. They threatened all. So William Davy led his poor wife to rest here, and also 2 of their children, William and Thomas. And this particular memorial, it has 2 corbels supporting the stone at the bottom, and they are carved into cherubs' heads. So I now think of those as William and Thomas Davy. Now, William Davy, in the 1852 street directory for Hercules Street in Belfast, there were 55 fleshers, 55 butchers on that street, and 5 of those were Davies. So this was a dynasty of butchers. And in this cemetery, there's actually 6 burial lots owned by Davies, amounting to about 14 graves. And they fed the growing city of Belfast in the Victorian era. And William Davy, his competitor and neighbour, was a man called James Boston. James was quite a bit older than William, and William had taken a fancy to his daughter, Margaret. So he had actually married James Boston's daughter. And in his father-in-law's honour, he named a son after him, James Boston Davy. And secondly, in 1852, he actually buried his father-in-law in this burying ground. And there also, in 1850, he buried another one of his children here as well. And William Davy himself, he lived for many more years. He was a very successful butcher, and he actually became an inspector of food establishments, and his son James Boston Davy, JB Davy, did as well. So they were a very successful butchering dynasty, Dynasty of Fleshers. And finally, in 1894, William Davy himself died, and 47 years after his wife died, he joined her in this burying ground at Friar's Bush. These stones between them, they tell the story of our city. So where I'm now standing are the graves of two remarkable men, but one of them is of particular interest, and his grave is unmarked, and this is the resting place of Montague Talbot, and he was buried here in 1831. Montague was from he was born in colonial Boston in 1774. His father was in the British Army, and his father was lost at sea when he was young. And his mother brought him and his siblings back to London. And Montague was to go to university in Essex to study law. And he was made, because to complete his law degree, an uncle was going to give him £30,000. Call that £1 million in modern money, a fortune. But Montague wasn't interested in law, because he, in his heart, wanted to be an actor. So he then trained to be an actor in London, and he made his debut in Covent Garden. And it was 1896. Or thereabouts, he made his debut, and from then on he acted. A lot of it was in Ireland, but in England as well, back and forth from London to Dublin. And he was left Dublin in 1896 to go to London for the sensational debut of a rediscovered Shakespeare play. But he ended up leaving London before the debut because of the controversy swirling around it. It was found to be a forgery. The one and only performance of this play, which is called Vortigern and Rowena, ended in disarray. And Montague may have been going to appear in it, but he got smartly out of town whenever all of the controversy was stirred up, whenever it was proven to be a fake. So Montague himself, he established himself as possibly the most busy and dynamic actor in Georgian Ireland. And he came to Belfast, and in 1808 he became the manager, the theatre impresario of the new theatre in Belfast. He also managed a theatre in Newry and a theatre in Derry. And he was busy in a theatre in Limerick as well. And one in Drogheda, maybe. He might have overstretched himself at times, because he was a manager and actor. So he seemed to have a frenetic lifestyle. And he then, he eventually retired from that. And I don't think he went bankrupt, but I think he'd taken on too much. And he died then and is buried here in Belfast. He spent quite a bit of time in Dublin, but he came back to Belfast for some reason. He wanted to be buried here. And I hear that it might have been his daughter was still in Belfast, and she wanted him buried here. But certainly he had spent a sizable proportion of his career in Belfast. And he's remembered in articles in newspapers. There have been occasional ones over the centuries since he died, telling his remarkable story and his connection to Belfast. And there's even still an old bill poster referring to him as Mr. Talbot. Everyone would have known who he was. So yes, so Montague Talbot, theatre impresario and actor, born in Boston in 1774. Well, I have been in and out of here for 2 years and more, investigating history, photographing, recording, noting down, doing tours and all. And I've never felt anything, but I'm a cynic when it comes to ghosts and paranormal activity. But the true history of here is shocking macabre and horror enough for me. The amount of stories of people who live short, miserable lives and are buried in here in their thousands. If ghosts really existed, you could not move in a place like this for ghosts. And the true horror is more than enough for me.